never thought my life would turn out like this. A woman in her mid-40s, standing alone in a beautiful house, more invisible than ever. What happens when the person sleeping next to you hasn't truly seen you in years? My husband was always away. His business trip stretched from days into weeks. And when he came back, his presence felt more like a formality than a reunion. We barely spoke about anything more than small talk, something we hadn't shared in years. I kept up appearances, cooked, cleaned, smiled at the neighbors, but inside I was fading. But then someone finally looked at me. The question is, who was it? It was early spring when my husband told me he was leaving again. This time for almost a month, I nodded, pretended to understand like always. I didn't protest. I never did. I had accepted this life. Or so I thought. Just a week after he left, my stepson Hayden came home from university for spring break. He was 22, tall, polite, and had always maintained a respectful distance. I had raised him since he was in high school, so our relationship had always been a quiet, formal bond. But now he was a man, and something about the way he looked at me had changed. It wasn't inappropriate, not at first, but it was different. I noticed his eyes linger a little longer. His compliments, once casual, now felt personal. "You look beautiful today," he said one morning in the kitchen. His voice was low. I laughed it off, but my heart fluttered. We started spending more time together, mostly by accident. He helped with groceries, busied himself cooking with me, and sat next to me during late-night TV shows. I tried to ignore the growing tension, but I wasn't blind. I felt it every time his hand brushed mine, every time he stood just a little too close. One evening, we sat on the porch watching the sunset. He told me he admired how I kept the family together, how strong I was for his father. I didn't know how to respond. I had never been praised like that, not in years. Something in his voice, soft but honest, cut through the wall I had built around myself. I looked at him and saw more than my stepson. I saw a man who saw me. A man who noticed that I was alive. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying our conversations, the way he looked at me, the way I didn't pull away. I told myself it was innocent, but deep down, I knew I was lying. I knew this was more than loneliness. I had crossed an emotional line I can no longer deny. When I saw him again the next morning, his smile made me nervous. I began to crave that attention, that feeling of being wanted, even if it was wrong. For the first time in a long time, I felt awake, but I was also afraid. I hadn't done anything. Not yet, but I knew I was close. And if something didn't stop me soon, I wasn't sure I could walk away from what was coming. It happened on a Thursday evening. The house was quiet and the air felt heavier than usual. I had just finished eating when the rain started pouring hard, followed by a sudden power outage. Without lights, without distractions, and only candles for light, the atmosphere had changed. Hayden walked into the living room. He was carrying 2 glasses of wine. "I thought you could use this," he said, smiling. I hesitated, but took the glass. We sat in silence. The only sound was the rain tapping against the windows. The wine loosened my defenses, and our conversation drifted from memories to emotions. He told me how lost he had been lately, how much he appreciated being home, and how safe he felt around me. I listened, comforted by the honesty. Then he said something that stunned me. "You don't even realize how incredible you are, do you?" I looked at him confused, but he didn't look away. "You deserve someone who sees you," he continued. "Someone who truly makes you feel alive." My heart pounded. I wanted to reject it. Tell him this was inappropriate, but I didn't. Instead, I let his words sink in. I craved affection, validation, and at that moment, it didn't matter who it came from. I told him I sometimes felt like I was fading in this house, like no one really saw me anymore. He reached for my hand, held it gently, and I didn't pull back. It felt so natural, so calm, as if we hadn't arrived here by choice, but had been pushed here by circumstance. His touch wasn't demanding. It wasn't aggressive. It was tender and sincere. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. His eyes didn't just look at me, they held me. They filled the spaces my husband had long abandoned. He leaned closer. I should have stopped him, but I didn't. Our lips met softly, slowly. It was a kiss that said more than words ever could. It wasn't wild or rushed. It was deep and full of emotions we had both buried. When it ended, we sat in silence, both knowing we had crossed a line we couldn't uncross. I stood up, said I needed to go to bed, and left him without another word. But sleep didn't come. My heart was racing, my thoughts spinning. I knew what we had done was wrong. It wasn't just a kiss. It was betrayal. Not just to my husband, but to everything I thought I stood for. And yet, a part of me felt no regret. A part of me felt awake, seeing a way I had forgotten was possible. I couldn't explain it. I didn't even want to. But I knew nothing would ever be the same. Something inside had shifted. Something I could never put back. The next morning, I avoided eye contact. I moved through the kitchen as if everything was normal, but nothing was the same. Hayden came into the room casually, but I noticed the change in his demeanor. Calm, confident, as if a boundary had been crossed, and he had no regrets. He offered to help with breakfast. I nodded without looking up. The tension between us was silent but unmistakable. We didn't talk about the kiss. Neither of us brought it up, but it hung in the air like a secret, too loud to ignore. I kept telling myself it had just been a moment, a lapse in judgment. But when his hand brushed mine again, I didn't move. When he stood close behind me to get a plate, I felt a response I couldn't control. Both shame and excitement. Later that day, I caught him looking at me, not in an indifferent way, but with intention. His eyes studied me, my face, my movements, every detail as if it mattered. I hadn't felt that kind of attention in years. Not from my husband, not from anyone. It was wrong. I knew it. But I couldn't stop myself from wanting more. Hayden started spending more time at home than with his friends. He made excuses to be near me, movie nights, groceries, walks. Our conversations deepened. He asked about my childhood, my dreams, what I had given up over the years. I realized how much of myself I had buried for the sake of a marriage that gave me nothing back. I tried to set boundaries. I told him this couldn't continue, that it was dangerous and reckless. He listened, nodded, even apologized, but the next moment he found me alone. He whispered that he couldn't stop thinking about me, that I deserved more than to be left behind by a man who didn't even notice when I cried myself to sleep. Every word felt like a needle stitching me back together. One evening, he touched my face and said, "You don't have to. Keep pretending. You're allowed to feel something again." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The way I looked at him said enough. The emotional line had been crossed long ago. What followed wasn't planned. It was inevitable. I didn't recognize myself anymore. I was a woman torn between guilt and desire, between loyalty and the aching need to be wanted. I told myself I was still in control, that I could stop this before it went too far. But the truth was, I'd already fallen. Yet I feared the consequences, not just of being caught, but of what would happen when he left again, when his vacation ended and I was alone in this house once more. Would he take this version of me with him, or would I be left broken again? This time by mistake I could never repair. Hayden's vacation was coming to an end, and the weight of what we had done began to press harder on both of us. I could see it in his quiet moments. The way he looked but said less. Something about our silence now felt heavier, not intimate, but guilty. He started packing, and with each folded shirt, I watched pieces of my fragile world crumble. We had crossed a line. Yes, but now what? We never talked about what would happen after. He promised nothing and I asked for nothing. I didn't want illusions. I had lived long enough, shrouded in false security with a man who barely noticed me. But this was different. It was raw, intense, and wrong, but real. And now, it had to end. The night before he left, he came to me. He looked unsure for the first time since this began. He didn't reach for me. He just looked at me as if he wanted to say something, but couldn't. "I don't regret anything," he said softly. "But I don't want to ruin your life either." I nodded, unable to answer. My throat tightened. I wasn't sure if it was heartbreak or relief. When he left the next morning, I stood at the door like a stranger watched. Someone walk out of her life without ceremony? No goodbye, no promise, just a moment that was cut short. The house returned to its silence, but this time it felt colder. Days passed and my husband came back as if nothing had changed. He brought souvenirs, stories from meetings, talked about business deals during dinner. He didn't notice the way I avoided his eyes. He didn't notice how hollow I had become. I had given myself emotionally and physically to someone else, and it showed, but only to me. At first, I thought I would be consumed by guilt, but instead I felt an aching sadness, not just for what I had done, but for the years I'd wasted feeling invisible. The betrayal wasn't just in the touch or the kiss. It was in the realization that someone who shouldn't even matter had seen me more clearly in 1 week than my husband had in years. Hayden sent one message, a simple text, "Take care of yourself." I stared at it for hours before deleting it. I knew we couldn't continue, and I also knew I couldn't go back to the way things were. I had changed, and I couldn't undo that change. In the end, I was left with a marriage that on the surface was still intact but completely hollow inside. I live each day next to a man who thinks everything is fine while I carry the weight of choices I can't take back. And maybe that is the real punishment, not being caught, but having to live with the truth in silence. I learned that love without attention is just a habit, and attention without commitment is just a temptation. Somewhere in between, I lost a version of myself that I will never get.